NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is speaking now in Brussels. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Annual report. This report is basically a summary of what we have discussed, what we have decided, and also what we have done as NATO throughout 2025. And it was quite an eventful year. We see clearly that our world is constantly changing, and we are adapting to ensure we remain prepared. Putin's war of aggression continued, as did support for Russia's war from China, from Iran, North Korea, and Belarus. We saw increasingly reckless Russian behavior in the context of NATO territory, whether through airspace violations or hybrid threats. China continued its military build-up. The threat from terrorism persisted. The threat picture across 2025 made clear the need to do more. And throughout the year, NATO continued to come together to ensure that we are ready and able to respond to any threat across all domains, both now and in the future. Last year, NATO began a new chapter in our common defense. We recognize collectively that this complex and more dangerous security environment called for a bolder approach, one that demands a stronger, a fairer, and a more lethal alliance. And that is why at the NATO Summit in The Hague, allies took a historic decision to raise defense investment to 5% of GDP. And as allies are now allocating more to invest in crucial capabilities, we need to ensure that the supply meets our demand. So we also agreed to ramp up defense production and innovation to ensure our industries can provide what our militaries need. These were defining decisions that will shape the future of our alliance for years to come. The figures in the report speak for themselves. We have made significant progress on defense investment, and NATO is stronger today than it has ever been. In 2025, for the first time, all allies met the goal agreed in 2014 to invest at least 2% of their GDP on defense. And many went much further. In fact, we saw 20% increase in what Europe and Canada spent on defense in 2025 as compared with 2024. Continuing this crucial trend will be a priority in the years to come. For too long, European allies and Canada were over-reliant on US military might. We did not take enough responsibility for our own security. But there has been a real shift in mindset, a collective recognition of our changed security environment. And as a European, I'm proud of what we are doing, the tremendous progress being made. We are investing because it is crucial to be able to address the threats we face. Russia remains the most significant and dire threat to security in the Euro-Atlantic area. In the past year, Russia has tried to test our security and disrupt and divide our societies, whether through airspace violations, sabotage, and malign cyber activities, or political interference and information threats. NATO's response to reckless provocation, whether from Russia or others, has been clear, swift, and decisive. Damage to our critical undersea infrastructure prompted the creation of Baltic Sentry to better guard against potential threats to our undersea infrastructure. In September, airspace violations from Russian drones over Poland led to the creation of Eastern Sentry, further strengthening Allied deterrence along the eastern flank, from the high north to the Black Sea. Through both Baltic and Eastern Sentry, we are testing new solutions and integrating innovation, including through the use of drones and counter-drone technologies. And as we continue to invest in the deterrence and defense of the whole of NATO, we also continue to provide crucial support to Ukraine. Our security is so closely connected. And that's why in 2025, allies provided the overwhelming majority of military assistance to Ukraine. This was in addition to ongoing humanitarian support and other forms of non-lethal aid. In February 2025, we opened JTEC in Poland, the first joint NATO-Ukraine center to share lessons learned from the war. In the summer of 2025, we launched Pearl, providing billions of euros worth of vital American military hardware to Ukraine, paid for by NATO allies and partners. We continued to deliver crucial support through NSATU, our command in Wiesbaden, and we worked with allies and partners who formed the Coalition of the Willing in 2025 to ensure that, once the war comes to an end, there are security guarantees in place to secure the peace. 2025 was a landmark year for NATO. This is clearly demonstrated and documented in this annual report, which I'm proud to share with you today. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, let's start over here in the fourth row, Associated Press.
Lorne Cook from the Associated Press. You said again today that NATO is stronger than it's ever been, and when I read the document, I feel there's like this collective, there's kind of a dissonance between what we see in the world and what we have to say about NATO. We've got an ally that had its designs on Greenland. A bunch of other allies had to go there with a trigger force, right, to keep this ally away. We've had that ally calling others cowards. We have the Secretary of State and Defense who don't turn up. Russia remains the biggest threat to NATO, and it doesn't seem like President Putin is intimidated at all, really. And you've said yourself within the next few years he could launch an attack somewhere in Europe. How is it that NATO is so strong in these circumstances?
Well, let me answer that question head on. And I've said it before. I don't believe that with the present American administration, the whole of NATO would have been reaching the 2% at the end of 2025. Take some big economies like Spain and Italy and Belgium and Canada. We're far from the 2% mark. They all got to the 2%. And this is bringing in billions and billions of euros/dollars to spend on defense. And then the Hague Summit, without the present administration in the United States and the present president, I don't think we would ever have reached this commitment to spend 5% of our GDP on defense, including the 3.5% on core defense. And then finally, I think it was very important that the new American president coming in, Trump 47, opened the dialogue again with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Because in the end, it was only the United States, I believe, who was able to break that deadlock. So that would be my direct reaction to your question.
Okay, and just next to him, Terry.
Thank you. That's efficient. Hi, Terry
Hi.
Schultz
Good morning.
with DW. Just to follow up a little bit on Lauren, you wouldn't have the higher defense spending, but you also wouldn't have had the insecurity that many European countries felt by the threat of one ally to attack another. But more broadly, when you look at the threat picture as you give it, and you say that it's much more dangerous, the Middle East doesn't come up, and yet so many of your public statements over the last weeks have been about how NATO allies need to support the U.S. in its efforts on Iran. I mean, do you feel that this is now a NATO issue? And how much are you working behind the scenes to do what you have advocated, and that is support the United States in its attacks on Iran? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And this is not new. The alliance, NATO, has for some time been clear, even before I became Secretary General, that Iran cannot possess a nuclear weapon. And NATO has also long recognized the threat Iran's missile program posed to allies and their interests. And what the United States is currently doing is degrading those capabilities, both the nuclear and the missile. And Take as an example what happened with Diego Garcia, the UK-US base, which was targeted by a missile which therefore could reach 4,000 kilometers. So the logical conclusion of that missile launch is that Iran has now capabilities increasingly dangerous for allies. Of course, the good news is that NATO stands firmly with all allies. We successfully, as you know, intercepted ballistic missiles heading to Turkey from Iran on 3 separate occasions. And when it comes to making sure that sea lanes are opening up again, and if they have opened up again, that collectively we are able to, as a world community, to make sure that ships can sail there. We have now 30 countries coming together, many from NATO, but also Japan and Korea, Australia and New Zealand and Bahrain and the UAE, but most of them from NATO, to discuss and then implement the question of the what, the where and the when it comes to making sure that these sea lanes stay open.
Okay, let's come over here. Second row, BBC.
Thanks very much, Mr. Rutte.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Congratulations with your new Director General.
I'll pass that on. The first question is on Iran. You told our partners at CBS News that President Trump is doing this to make the whole world safe. I was just wondering how you can argue that in the short and medium term, and also how concerned you are about the impact on Ukraine, because you talk about how it's so central to Europe's security, and we've seen already how it's really benefiting President Putin, what's happening in terms of the easing of sanctions on oil, and that the Ukrainian conflict is being overshadowed, which I know is a concern of yours. And secondly, if I may, you have made a conscious decision not to criticize President Trump publicly. You're among a number of figures on the global stage who have done that. But just last week, he was saying that NATO allies were cowards for not joining what's happening in Iran, joining him and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in that Truth Social post, he ended it by saying, we will remember. Now, whether or not President Trump is aware of this, but that has real echoes and chimes with words of remembrance that for more than 100 years, people in Europe in particular have been using that sort of phrase, we will remember them. So I just wonder, I'm not inviting you to criticize President Trump, because I know that's something you've been reluctant to do, but how does that touch you? How does that feel you when you see that sort of post?
Well, thank you. Let me, various elements in the question. So first on Ukraine, the good news is that essential equipment into Ukraine continues to flow. And that is important because we have to do everything, and NATO is very much involved through the Command in Wiesbaden, through JTAC, individual nations providing support to Ukraine, including the essential equipment coming from the United States, paid for by European allies, getting into Ukraine. So that continues, that's good. Then when it comes to the comments of President Trump, as I said also on CBS, what I've been seeing is some frustration with him about the Europeans needing to take time to react to his request when it comes to this question of making sure that sea lanes are open. And I said, hey, there is a reason for that. And the reason is that for good reasons, the US was not able to consult with allies because they wanted to keep the campaign secret. And again, for good reasons, to make sure that nobody knew what happened on that Saturday morning. There's always a risk if you inform too many people that things might leak. But that also had the disadvantage that it takes time for the Europeans to get organized. The good news now is that thanks to the leadership from the United Kingdom, France and others, originally 6 countries, the UK, France, Italy and Germany and Japan and the Netherlands, then on Friday 22 countries and by now over 30 countries have committed to come together to discuss the what, the where and the when it comes to making sure that the sea lanes stay open. And this is exactly also to the request of President Trump. And more generally, when it comes to the Middle East and this situation with Iran, NATO has been consistent over the years that NATO does not want, as an alliance, and this is a collective position, for Iran to get its hand on either a nuclear capability or a missile capability.
Okay, we'll go to the 4th row. Interfax Ukraine in the center.
Hi, ma'am. Good morning.
Goedemiddag.
Goedemiddag, u spreekt Nederlands.
Klein beetje, dank u wel. Thank you, Alison. News agency Interfax Ukraine, Irina Sommer. Follow up what you just said, that American weapons continue to flow to Ukraine. Washington Post just reported that Pentagon might consider to redirect weapons which is going to Ukraine to Middle East. So what do you know about it? Because it's mentioned that it is already weapons which already was pre-ordered in the frame of Pearl, NATO program for Ukraine. So what do you know about this and what NATO is going to do or would do if it will happen? Thank you.
Well, as I already mentioned in reaction to another question, this crucial equipment through Pearl, so this US vital equipment for Ukraine, including interceptors, is continuing to flow into Ukraine. And let me add that since the launch, and that was, of course, last summer, Pearl has now supplied around 75% of all missiles for Ukraine's Patriot batteries and 90% of the ammunition used in other air defense systems. So this is an important program, again, continuing to flow.
Fourth row, also in the center, Anadolu.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. This is Shirley
Hi, good
from
morning.
NATO Agency. Good morning. You've mentioned your efforts regarding the formation of a multinational coalition outside of NATO to address the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. But I want to focus more on the NATO dimension of the conflict. And you've mentioned it yourself. In light of the recent developments in the region, the ballistic missile attacks on Turkey, a NATO territory, on 3 occasions, actually. I would like to know, is the alliance taking or planning to take additional measures to augment Turkey's security? Could you kindly elaborate on those? Thank you.
Well, obviously, I cannot go into the more secretive military planning, but I can assure you one thing. NATO is the strongest military alliance in world history. And we will do everything as 32 allies, the United States and Canada and the 30 allies in Europe, to do everything to defend every inch of NATO territory. And taking out these 3 missiles heading for Turkey is clear evidence of that, and we will continue to do so, and making clear to any adversary that we will do everything necessary to indeed make sure that we are safe.
Okay, coming over here to the second row towards the center.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
From Breaking Defense.
From?
Breaking Defense, sorry. This week, the CEO of Rheinmetall warned that European, American, and Middle Eastern munition stockpiles were nearly empty. In the 2025 report, it says that in line with the updated Defense Production Action Plan, greater spending would allow for a rapid expansion of such production. How do you explain these claims that NATO countries still have near empty munitions despite years of warning, and what concrete steps will you take to fix that gap? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this is clearly one of the main focus areas also in Ankara at the NATO Summit, no doubt, how to make sure that we ramp up defense production, because defense production in the end is an integral part of our overall deterrence and defense. It is the men and women in uniform, but also making sure they have what they need to fight the wars which others want to mount on us, and we then will defeat them if they try. When it comes to ammunition particularly, as you know, there is some good news that we have been able to increase the production of ammunition 6-fold compared to a couple of years ago. But still, clearly, there is more to do. And when you look at the broader defense industrial base, and this is an issue which we have to confront both in the United States and Canada as well as in Europe, the defense industrial base at the moment is simply not producing enough, and we are not fast enough in implementing innovation. We are getting better, but we have to do more. One of the reasons why we started the 2 sentries last year and also Arctic Sentry this year is not only to defend what we try to defend and will defend through the centuries, but also to make sure that we know where the gaps are, which capabilities we need to develop, including when it comes to innovation. Take, for example, drone and anti-drone technology. Here, as also is now the case in the Middle East, we can learn from Ukraine. But there are other examples. Also examples of how to make sure that the latest innovation, AI technologies, are an integral part of our overall defense. So this is crucial. I know the American president had a meeting with the 5 primes in the US. I spoke with one of the CEOs afterwards. That was a very effective meeting. We are doing the same, of course, here with national leaders like President Macron and others sitting with defense industry here in Europe. And Finally, this is of course a transatlantic issue, but it is also a transatlantic defense industrial base. More and more we see European companies investing in the United States, but we also see US companies setting up shop here to, for example, produce missiles for Patriots.
Okay, and we're going to the back now. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Thanks so much, Thomas Kutschka with FAZ.
Where are you? Oh, yeah, there.
Here.
Yeah.
2 questions, please. The first one, there's a report out today claiming that Russia now delivers combat drones to Iran. Can you confirm this? Does not NATO have any information about this? So the other way. And the second question, completely unrelated, the former Lithuanian Foreign Minister Landsbergis has called for a NATO investigation into whether Hungary and especially Hungarian Foreign Minister Szijjártó has leaked confidential information from NATO meetings. You've heard what he said about his behavior before and after EU meetings. Do you see reason of concern that he's behaved in the same way when he met with fellow NATO colleagues? And if so, would you launch an investigation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the first question, of course we know that Russia, Iran, North Korea and China are working closely together. We know that Iran is one of the suppliers of essential gear for Russia to maintain and solidify its war against its unsolicited provocation, war against Ukraine. That's clear. So it tells you something when these reports come out that Russia is sharing so much also with Iran. So let's not be naive about that. I cannot tell you what intelligence is telling us because obviously that's intelligence, so that we keep that secret. But you can see yourself from open sources, and we noticed for some years that there is a close connection between Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China. And then on the second question, all 32 allies, they all agree that Russia is our most significant threat. There is no discussion about that. A threat to our security now and longer term, and also that all 32 allies are totally committed to make sure that we have the collective defense in place, we take the necessary steps required to ensure indeed that we can deter and defend. So we're working together with all allies on this every day.
Okay, now the third row in the center, Al Jazeera. Wait for the mic, please. Wait for the mic, please.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Step Fazer from Al Jazeera.
Hi.
I want to clarify something because you have been under criticism in the last couple of days because of the interviews you gave in the weekend. European diplomats felt you overstepped your role because the mood in Europe was not endorsing the war Israel and the US are now fighting, but there was a much more hesitation, and also the fact that you said all these countries are coming together. The message the European nations were saying that they only want to help when there is a ceasefire, or at least the fighting has stopped. The message you're giving now sounds different, so could you please respond to this criticism and clarify exactly what these 30 countries are going to do?
Yeah, I don't think I think I'm still saying the same, and that is that, as I said also on Sunday, that NATO has always been consistently clear that the whole of the alliance, that obviously for Iran to possess a nuclear or a missile capability poses a threat not only to the region, an existential threat, by the way, to potentially Israel, but also a threat to Europe. And Iran is an exporter of chaos to the region and to the world for many years now. Let's not be naive about that. And what the United States is doing now is degrading that capability. And yes, I applaud that. In the alliance, you will always have different views. That's unavoidable. It is an alliance of democracies. But when it comes to not accepting Iran having a nuclear and missile capability, we all agree. The whole of the alliance has also condemned the indiscriminate attacks of Iran on its neighbors. That was in a meeting only last week with ambassadors also of the Gulf states here at NATO headquarters. And then, indeed, when it comes to this group of countries coming together, most of them from NATO, to make sure that the Strait of Hormuz, the sea lanes, are open, And indeed, that begs the question, given the fact that the war is ongoing. What does that mean in terms of the what question, the when question, and the where question? Actively now, countries are working together. The United Kingdom is leading that effort under Prime Minister Starmer and the senior military in the United Kingdom, together with France and others, to make sure that those questions will be answered. And this is to President Trump's request. He said, hey, I would have rather have that seen earlier starting. And there my reaction is, Europe needed time because the United States, for good reasons, was not able to inform allies of what was going to happen now 3.5 weeks ago on Saturday morning, because that would have that would have potentially led to a leak or whatever. That was always a risk when the US had the opportunity to take out Iran's leadership. So I totally understand that. I don't criticize that, but it means that it takes some time for Europe to come together, and that's happening as we speak.
All right, second row, Reuters.
Thank you very much, Lee from Reuters. I'd
Hi.
actually like
Good
to
morning.
follow up on Irina's question.
You're watching France 24, and we've just been listening to the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, there giving a press conference that is meant to be on the annual report from NATO for 2025. But a lot of those journalist questions were obviously about what's going on in the Middle East. James Andre was listening to that with me as well. I mean, it really seems that that has been the main focus, something that Mark Rutte didn't really even mention in his initial part of that speech.
Yes, absolutely. It was actually interesting to hear that first question by an AP reporter, I believe, where saying, look, there is a bit of a dissonance here. You're saying that the alliance is more powerful than it's ever been. And then on the other hand, he asked questions about the threat of basically the United States, being on the edge of that alliance. And it's true that, this press conference is taking place just minutes after Donald Trump tweeted about the NATO alliance. I believe we have this tweet to show you on Truth Social. It wasn't a tweet, it was a truth, but basically saying that...
I think we can even listen to it, James. Let's just go ahead and listen to what Donald Trump had to say this morning.
NATO nations have done absolutely nothing to help with the lunatic nation now militarily decimated of Iran. The USA needs nothing from NATO, but never forget this very important point in time.
So you see there, a thinly veiled threat. Never forget. So indeed what we have is indeed an alliance which has a big problem with the posture of the United States. Now it's interesting to note that when it comes to the situation in Iran, Mark Rutte has made it very clear that for the 32 members of the alliance, the main threat is Russia. But still, he's also saying, and he did say, and I quote, that in his view, NATO allies need to support the United States in its war on Iran, stating that indeed NATO has always considered Iran to be a threat, always considered that Iran should never have a nuclear weapon, but also explaining that for now, the European partners had said that they would like to, keep, I'd say, a relatively back foot stance when it comes to this war. So what you understand is that Mark Rutte is quite clearly working in the background to try and get more NATO involvement. He also stressed the fact that 3 missiles had been intercepted on their way to Turkey. But yes, it's there is this Middle East concern, and also he did talk about the problem of the ammunition stockpiles, which are indeed being taken away from Europe in part to be sent to Iran, but also stressing that in his view there needs to be more done to indeed recreate these stockpiles, that the industry needs to ramp up. Also saying, and this is true, that he is happy to see the budget increasing by 20% in 2025, which is, of course, a big hike when it comes to the financing of NATO, saying that it is now more fair. And in his view, he says, that for him, this is the strongest military alliance on earth right now.
And absolutely. And he also paid lip service to Donald Trump, saying that if the countries were reaching that at least 2% of GDP, it was thanks to Donald Trump. Talk to us a bit more about Mark Rutte's relationship with Donald Trump at this point.
Well, the thing is, Mark Rutte is, of course, remembered as a lot as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, so he's seen as a European politician. But you've got to remember that Mark Rutte's job is to be the Secretary General of NATO. Being the Secretary General of an organization like NATO means that you are indeed coordinating efforts by a vast number of countries, 32 in this case. And basically the biggest partner is the United States of America. So if this was a company, Mark Rutte would be the CEO. And basically the United States and the Donald Trump administration would be the biggest stakeholder in that company, which is right now saying that it is not happy with what's being done by this company. So if you are the CEO and you want to keep your job, well, you have to pay some lip service to Donald Trump. Now, I do believe that Mark Rutte has been very efficient when it comes to dealing with Donald Trump, telling him what he needed to hear on some occasions, also managing, and we all remember that, this was this year in Davos, Switzerland at the summit, if you remember, de-escalating, and we don't exactly know how he did that, what was a major crisis with Greenland at the time. But it's true that these questions are being asked to Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte is obviously, I'd say, avoiding any criticism of Donald Trump. But given his posture, his job, that does make sense.
And Mark Rutte also said that it was thanks to Donald Trump if Ukraine was really back on the world stage at this point. Talk to us a bit more about NATO's role in the war with Russia and Ukraine at the moment, and if it really has the money and the resources to help.
Well, that's the big question mark. It's true that NATO has been, the main backer of Ukraine through a variety of programs. One of the main ones, and this is something he indeed talked about, was the JTEC initiative, which is very much a coordination between NATO and the Ukrainian army, which today is one of the most powerful on the European continent. 800,000 men. Right now, we have people being sent from Ukraine to the Middle East in order to help with drone attacks in Iran. I mean, they are very, very good. They've learned a lot. And indeed, this interoperability, as it's called in military terms, between NATO and Ukraine is being built up, it's being strengthened. And, concretely, if you take strategically, yes, Ukraine is one of the biggest pieces in the eastern flank of European defense. And of course, this is done with NATO. When it comes to him saying that this is thanks to Donald Trump, what Donald Trump has done with NATO is, yes, given more responsibility to the European countries, push them to spend more when it comes to their military defense, but he also scaled back the United States' help towards Ukraine, or at least making sure the Europeans are paying for it. And this is another initiative he talked about, and that is PURL, P-U-R-L, which is basically the concept of the European nations buying American equipment to send it to Ukraine. Basically, the financial burden of this aid to Ukraine has now been transferred, if you will, to Europe. Or at least the spending has been rebalanced, which is something Donald Trump wanted to see. Now, to the question, Mark Rutte tells you, yes, this administration has helped NATO. Funding is up, 20% more budget, probably a fairer balance between European nations who used to count very much on European military might for their security, and this is being balanced out. On the other hand, United States political stance when it comes to Russia, very unclear with Donald Trump basically not being, very aggressive against Russia. Also the fact that, yes, the Ukraine war right now is fading into the background compared to the war in Iran. That we'll have to see how long that war goes on for. And indeed, the United States, which is, in a sense, if dangling this possibility that the US might leave the alliance, which is something Donald Trump has, made allusions to, though it's never been stated very clearly, would indeed, destroy the credibility of NATO. So, when it comes to this administration and NATO, it is probably, I'd say, more, it's weakening the alliance more than it is strengthening it. But that is not Mark Rutte who will tell you that.
James, thank you for that. France 24's James Andre.